I'll eat my popcorn now.
Talk don't bother.
There's the camera right there, by the way, looking that way.
I want the whole wide world to know.
My father was here. He'd be talking to me. He's a president. I would say.
They're from near Naples, on the hills around Naples, and they still are there.
Everybody.
Hi, welcome to Let Them Talk. I'm Paul DeRienzo.
And I'm Miss Joan Moossy.
And our guest is Peter Lance, author Peter Lance, an investigative reporter, and we're here to talk about a very serious subject, that's been in the news for the last week or more now. That started with these airplane flights that were from between London and the United States and New York, where the passengers were forced to go through all these investigations, and they had all their gels and liquids and toothpaste and their shoes, cosmetics.
The worst.
There's actually, of course, there's a story behind all this, and leave it to Let Them Talk and our investigative team to get down to the heart of what really this is all about, because it is a much bigger story, and in a sense, it's an old story. And Peter,
welcome, Peter.
Yes, welcome, Peter.
Great to be here.
Yes. Peter, let me see some of your books. I just wanted to, behind us is the cover of Cover Up, and if you can see it says that's the 9/11 Commission report in the background, and you see a paper cover that says Cover Up over that, and what the government is still hiding about the war on terror, Regan Books, and your first book, right, on this subject?
Exactly.
Right, 1,000 Years for Revenge, International Terrorism and the FBI, and you have a new book that's coming out as well.
Yeah, what I hope is the third and final book in the trilogy. It's called Triple Cross, and it's this amazing story of Al-Qaeda spy named Ali Mohammed, who actually infiltrated the U.S. in the mid-'80s. He worked at it for a time with the CIA. Then he actually joined the U.S. Army, was stationed at Fort Bragg. As an active duty officer, was stealing top-secret files from Fort Bragg while he was coming up weekends to New York to train the original World Trade Center bombing cell. This is true. And then he became an FBI informant in '92, a year before the Trade Center bombing, and literally planned the African embassy bombing while he was associated with the FBI. It's an absolutely extraordinary story.
Now, Peter, before we get into all the details of this subject, and there are many of them, how do you know things that these investigators who spent millions and billions of dollars of taxpayers' money were not able to find out beforehand in order to prevent these things? And I'm not sure we got a handle on it because even the chairs of the 9/11 Commission themselves have come out and said they were intimidated from telling the truth.
Well, first of all, I'm an independent investigative reporter. I'm classically trained. I was a correspondent for ABC News, went to Columbia J School. I have a law degree from Fordham. So I have the skill set. And right after 9/11, my son, Christopher, who had been at Stuyvesant High School that day, there was some question about whether they were in jeopardy. The next day I said, like any American, how did this happen, and could it happen again? And I happen to have the ability to just kick over rocks and start investigating. Also, I'm not with a major mainstream media outlet, so I'm not beholden to anybody. I don't have to go back to the FBI and to try and get information. So I decided to look at the FBI and the Justice Department. Why? Because on the road to 9/11, that was, up until 9/11, the war on terror was fought as a series of legal cases. The New York office of the FBI and the Southern District, the two bin Laden offices of origin, were the central repository of knowledge about Al-Qaeda. So I went back and I decided, well, how did these guys blow it, if you will? This was the greatest intelligence failure, not since Pearl Harbor, since the Trojan horse, okay? So how did this happen? It was a $40 billion a year intelligence apparatus between the big five agencies. How did this happen? So what I did is I read the 40,000 pages of trial transcripts in the Southern District cases. First World Trade Center trial, the Day of Terror plot to blow up the bridges and tunnels, the Bojinka case involving Ramzi Youssef, which is relevant to this plot this week, the second Trade Center case with the Youssef, ultimately the African embassy bombing case in 2001. Then I went back, and for this particular book, I got the El Sayed Nasser case, the fellow that killed Rabbi Kahani in 1990, because truthfully,
although aren't we jumping? Because in fact, wasn't he acquitted of that?
He was acquitted of the actual shooting and later convicted by the feds of the murder, but he was essentially taken off the streets. But to answer your question simply, as an independent investigative reporter, I was able to ask questions that I think first of all, the people in power, the people in the FBI, who later, many of which went on the 9/11 Commission. Jamie Gorelick was Deputy Attorney General, was one of the commissioners. She was certainly not going to ask the tough questions about whether they screwed up, because she was, in effect, part of the system, if you will. And so I was able to ask questions. I read every single book relating to 9/11. I made these extraordinary notes. I put together a timeline. And then I began to develop sources inside the FBI, current agents who really are conscientious and want the right thing to be done, and also people on the outside, whistleblowers, disgruntled agents, etc. So the first book that I wrote, if you will, 1,000 Years for Revenge, this title refers to a saying in Baluchistan, which is where Ramzi Youssef comes from: if it takes me 10 centuries to kill my enemy, I will wait 1,000 years for revenge. And it's.
Can I show this? I'm going to show this closer to the camera, and without stepping on my microphone too badly. And here it is. Let's see if we have enough light so folks can see it. Yeah.
And it's about the Crusades. It's about payback. Really, when bin Laden talks about, the West, he talks about the Jews and the Crusaders. He's talking about Israel, and he's talking about the Christian West. And so the pathology that is the result of this latest wave of Islamic fascism, if you will, is deep-seated. So what I did was I went back and I took the timeline to 9/11. The 9/11 Commission really went from 1998 forward. I took it back to 1989, and Calvin.
Where do you start yours?
If you look at this, Calvin in Long Island, this is such an important thing, because ironically, even in my first
I'll walk
book,
ahead. I
had the picture that in the lower. I can't tell whether it's camera right or left, but you see the fellow in the lower.
By this finger? Which finger? By this area?
This one here. No, the other fellow.
This on this side.
That's Ali Muhammad. I actually had him in the beginning of my timeline in the first book. Ali Muhammad was an ex-Egyptian intelligence officer, a radical. His unit was the unit that murdered Anwar Sadat, believe it or not. He was targeted by the number 2 man in Al-Qaeda, Dr. Ayman al-Zawahiri, to enter the U.S. in the mid-'80s, become a sleeper, essentially. He was a classically trained spy. And so he flew into America in 1985. On the plane, he meets this American woman, 10 years his senior, essentially seduces her. They get married 6 weeks later at a drive-through wedding chapel in Reno, Nevada. A few weeks later, he's watering her condo in the heart of Silicon Valley. He then enlists in the U.S. Army and is as an enlisted man as opposed to officer, where he'd be subject to more rigorous vetting. Ends up at Fort Bragg at the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare School. Now, this is the heart of the Defense Intelligence Agency's black operations. It's a Delta Force, the Green Berets, and he's literally stealing top secret memos from the Joint Chiefs and coming up on weekends. And this timeline shows that the FBI, the New York office, the best of the best, were photographed. This is actually a surveillance photo. The FBI began photographing him on 4 weekends in 1989. Now, this is when Bush 41 is in the White House, okay? And what these gentlemen photographed by the FBI, this is the one, El Sayed Nusayr, who killed Rabbi Kahane, and which I say is the first Al-Qaeda blood spilled on American soil. And these 3 individuals were later convicted in the World Trade Center bombing, and this individual was convicted in the plot to blow up the bridges and tunnels. So the FBI had these guys on their radar screen in 1989, and they basically.
Well, I remember the story. It was in the newspaper. It was exactly, and it caught a lot of people's attention. It was front page in the newspaper in the New York Times, and never heard from again.
And then never heard. And then after the bombing of the Trade Center, of course, they wrapped up the cell very quickly. Well, how did they wrap it up? They had a gentleman named Imad Salem, who had infiltrated, who was actually doing a really great job. He was making $500 a week. He was an ex-Egyptian himself, Army officer. There was a great agent named Nancy Floyd, and all of this is told in my first book. And anyway, what happened was an agent named Carson Dunbar, a senior agent who was really a desk jockey. He had no experience in terrorism. Didn't like Nancy, kind of felt threatened by her because she was a strong woman. Didn't trust Salem. Made him kind of re-audition for the part, and he left. And when he left, they lost their eyes and ears in the cell. Whereupon Ramzi Ahmed Youssef, the Mozart of terror, a bomb maker trained in Wales, an engineer, comes into New York September 2nd, 1992, okay? And he begins building this bomb in New Jersey. Who helps him? The same 3 guys that were photographed in Calvert and Long Island 2 years earlier by the FBI. And Salem went to pick up his last check from Nancy. Nancy Floyd was the FBI agent who was really well-intentioned, did what she could. And he said to her, Nancy, follow Mahmoud Abu Lima, follow the 6'2" red-headed Egyptian, follow Mohammed Salama, this Palestinian, and something's going on. I don't know what it is, but they, as it turned out, were right with Youssef building the bomb. All the FBI had to do was follow these highly visible guys, and they would have interdicted the first World Trade Center bombing.
Okay. Well, our number, by the way, I'm sorry, we have a lot of questions, and maybe we'll give folks an opportunity to call in. Here's our number, live 212-757-1541. Our guest, Peter Lance, who's the author of books including 1,000 Years for Revenge and the 9/11 Commission Cover-Up. And if you have any questions, we'll be happy to give it a shot and call us up. And Joni, you were going to ask a question. Go ahead. There's so many questions to ask, but you're telling the story so well, we don't have to. Go ahead.
Well, I wanted to ask you about the 9/11 conspiracy theorists who think that the U.S. government planned and executed the attack on the World Trade Centers, and I wondered what you thought about that theory.
To be honest with you, I only report what I can prove. And I think, frankly, what I've been able to prove is so astonishing, it goes beyond negligence and gross negligence. In my new book, I believe I actually have affirmative evidence of obstruction of justice by senior Justice Department and FBI officials. You don't have to go to the plane didn't fly into the Pentagon. It's like, first of all, when you go to those conspiracy theories, it makes it seem as if Al-Qaeda is not the formidable enemy that it is, and it truly is. So it diminishes our enemy, and it gives people a sense that, well, our government did this. No, our government, it's quite clear that senior officials over 3 administrations were negligent, and it's quite possible that 9/11 kind of, what I don't want to say was allowed to happen, because that also implies intent. And I've never found that. I just write what I can prove, and what I can prove, as I was able to find in all 3 of these books, and Triple Cross is the name of the new book, what I was able to prove was that in order to cover up earlier acts of negligence, the FBI and the Justice Department, let's say they had 20 dots on a chart on the road to 9/11. Every 3rd or 4th dot they'd cover up with like a Post-it, because it represented negligence, like the failure to stop the first bombing. They didn't want the public to know that, and by covering it up, they also then obscured the truth from other intelligence agencies. What should have been going on there, you have 5 big intelligence agencies: CIA, FBI, the NSA, the Defense Intelligence, and the State Department has one. And instead of pooling the resources and getting a full understanding of what Al-Qaeda was, they began to put sort of blinds on. And my second book, Cover Up, what I showed was this incredible story that could not be made up. No Hollywood plot could make up this story. And it was the story of how, when they finally captured Ramzi Youssef, and he is the architect of both the original World Trade Center bombing and 9/11, because after the first bombing, he fled to Manila ultimately, where his uncle, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, and 2 other conspirators...
Who was arrested in Iraq.
In Pakistan in March of '03, and is considered the mastermind of 9/11. But in fact, he just carried out the plot that his brilliant nephew designed.
Right. And so let's talk about that plot for a second, because I think that's where we have the tie-in to the last couple of weeks.
Right.
Because you have, in this book, don't you have a diagram? Can we look at the... Oh, it's marked great. Let's look at the diagram, and I want to show folks this diagram. And don't try this at home, okay? Please.
Right.
But we were going to show it to you, and
This is fascinating.
so people should know. Now, explain, Peter Lance, the author of this book, explain what we're looking at here.
Okay,
what is this picture
on the page that you're pointing, the picture that you're pointing to, let me just give you the quick background. When Youssef was in Manila, he had a cell, which we know was funded by bin Laden. Bin Laden's brother-in-law, Khalifa, bankrolled the cell, and they had 3 plots. Plot number 1, they were going to kill the Pope, who was going to be there in early January, with a series of pipe bombs along his parade route. Plot number 2 was called Bojinka, and that's the plot that relates to this latest discovery by the Brits. The Bojinka plot was a non-suicide plot. It was completely separate from 9/11. It involved getting on board the first leg of a 2-leg plane flight, a jumbo jet flight out of Asia. So, for example, they would get on, let's say, a United flight in Hong Kong that was going to go to Singapore first, take on American tourists, and then go to San Francisco. On the first leg of that hop, they would get on and they would smuggle the components of what I call the Casio Nitro bomb trigger. It was essentially a Casio watch, a DB61 watch that you could set up to a year in advance. And with this little circuit with a broken bulb initiator, Yusuf actually did a test of this bomb on a 747 on December 11th.
Describe that
and he got out. What he did was he smuggled these components in a shaving kit. And this is where the liquid point comes in, why liquid is so important. He got diluted nitroglycerin that he put into a contact lens cleaning bottle, had some other obscure toiletries in a little shaving kit. He had cotton balls, and then he had this Casio. He'd already soldered this special capacitor, and he had a little female connector tucked under the watch so they couldn't see it. He had religious medals around. He was posing as an Italian national so that if they wanted him and they got, okay. He also figured out by watching a CNN report that the metal detector started an inch off the ground. So long before Richard Reed, the shoe bomber, he had a 9-volt battery in the heel of each shoe, okay? So he gets on board this flight bound from Manila to Cebu in the southern Philippines on to Japan, and in the early morning hours puts together this device. He gets the 9 volts, snaps them into the circuit, he plugs the circuit into the watch, sets the watch 4 hours ahead. He now goes and shoves the cotton into the nitro, which becomes nitrocellulose or gun cotton, a high explosive. He breaks the bulb on the little, so there's like a little pigtail, it's a filament, shoves that carefully in, tapes it all up, and puts it all into the shaving kit and plants it in the 26th row. Now this is important because he believed the 26th row was over the center wing fuel tank of the plane. And what he was, so what he thought would happen is it would blow down, the plane would blow up. Well, he was
the explosion itself is not big enough to bring down a plane. The idea was to puncture the fuel tank and make the plane explode that way.
Exactly, and this shows you what kind of adversary we're dealing with, because this man went from building weapons of mass destruction to be taken by truck, or rider truck, if you will, from point A to point B to blow up a massive bomb, to these tiny little bomb triggers that would render a plane itself a flying bomb. And so he did this test, he gets off the plane, and this is important, that it wasn't a suicide. You don't have to learn how to fly a plane or go to a flight school to do this. So he gets off the flight and goes back to Manila. The plane on its way to Japan, the little watch goes off. The surge is enhanced by
the pocket underneath.
It's in the life jacket pouch underneath, and it blows down, kills the poor gentleman, Aruki Ikigami, 24-year-old Japanese, cuts him in half, blows down almost through the bottom of the plane, but is 3 feet behind the fuel tank. So they were heroically able to land the plane. But now they know it works. All they have to do is move it forward. Through an act of God, there's a fire in Yusuf's bomb factory. He and his uncle Khalid Sheikh flee to Pakistan. Yusuf is captured a month later. Khalid Sheikh escapes. Abdul Hakim Murad, his lifelong friend, and this is important, who had been to 4 U.S. flight schools in 91 and 92, got his pilot's license. Why is that important? Because the third plot that was going on in Manila was 9/11. And Colonel Rodolfo Mendoza, the head of the Philippines police, who interrogated Murad over 60 days, told me, I did the most extensive interview with him in 2002. He said, Peter, this was not a little plane flying into the CIA, which was initially what he was told. And that's, for years, that rumor has been going around, and the people in the intelligence agencies would say, well, how could we have extrapolated 9/11 from no? That was what Murad said in the first couple of days. Little by little, he said, we have up to 10 men training in flight schools. Our targets are the Trade Center, the Pentagon, CIA headquarters, ultimately the White House, I found out just recently, the Sears Tower, the Transamerica Tower, and a nuclear facility. And they had up to 10 men in 1995.
What does Bojinka mean? You call it the Bojinka?
Bojinka means big noise or explosion in Serbo-Croatian. And in Yusuf, who had done time with the brothers in Bosnia, he was just an outside-the-box thinker. So anyway, that plot was foiled. Obviously, Bojinka Plot was foiled by this fire.
And evidence of this was found on his laptop in the apartment.
Perfect. He had a Toshiba laptop. And in fact, in my new book, in Triple Cross, I actually was able to get to the Philippines computer expert who de-encrypted the laptop. So what happened with the story, the official story, is that the CIA got it, they sent it to Redmond, Washington, Microsoft de-encrypted it, and the fellow testified at trial. But they left out, they only talked about at trial the Bojinka Plot. They didn't mention this planes into buildings plot, okay? Well, I got to this gentleman, Rafael Garcia III, and his verbatim testimony is going to be in my new book. He was like the Bill Gates of the Philippines. They made the backup of the hard drive because the Philippines police didn't trust the CIA, and he told me point blank, he said, we had these 7 targets. In my original book, I didn't know about the White House. And ironically, Zacharias Moussaoui, when he copped the plea, said that his target was going to be the White House.
Did you mention the Pentagon in that list?
Yeah, the Pentagon.
It was in that list.
Yeah, it's in the list. So anyway, cut to the chase, to move a little bit further. 1996, they have the feds in the Southern District. Now keep in mind, the Southern District, the best of the best, it's the bin Laden office of origin.
Manhattan.
In Manhattan. It's the office that spawned Rudy Giuliani, Louis Freeh, Patrick Fitzgerald. And Patrick Fitzgerald, by the way, who's the special prosecutor in the CIA leak case and U.S. Attorney in Chicago.
In the Valerie Plame case.
Valerie Plame.
As well as the lawyer, the prosecutor against Lynn Stewart.
Exactly.
Right.
He was gone to Chicago.
Oh, I see.
He
prosecuted.
He and Andrew McCarthy did Sheikh Rahman and for Day of Terror. Patrick Fitzgerald, who is a brilliant lawyer, but as it turns out, he plays a key role in my new book because Squad I-49, from January of 1996 on, they dedicated a squad, as they should have, in the New York office to bin Laden, to making an indictment against bin Laden. Patrick Fitzgerald, as Vanity Fair laudatorily said, the brain, the living repository of knowledge on Al-Qaeda in the Justice Department, was the lead prosecutor, and they had elite FBI agents. Jack Clunan, Daniel Coleman was seconded to the Alex station, which is the CIA dedicated station. And by 1996, they finally, both the CIA and the FBI, began to really focus on bin Laden and began to make the book on him, if you will. Well, as it turns out, Patrick Fitzgerald, in my reporting, and you will see both in this book and you'll see in the new book, his he was head of organized crime and terrorism in the Southern District, and a decision was made. It's much too complicated to describe in this program, but a decision was made, an ends-means decision was made to bury a treasure trove of evidence on Al-Qaeda, including the presence of an Al-Qaeda cell in New York City, 4 people, a plot to hijack a plane to free the blind sheikh, which showed up in the famous presidential daily briefing of August 6th in Texas years later, a plot to kidnap a judge, to harm a federal prosecutor, all kinds of amazing Al-Qaeda-related evidence, including the evidence that Al-Qaeda was related to the Khobar Towers bombing in June of '96.
In Saudi Arabia, they killed 19
Americans. Yeah, Louis Freeh completely blames on Hezbollah, but in fact that Al-Qaeda was related to. Well, anyway, that treasure trove of information, including new information on the Bojinka Plot, which if the feds had acted upon it at that time and sounded the alarm on Al-Qaeda, could have given other agencies a much greater sense of the Al-Qaeda threat. That was buried for reasons that I get into in both of these books. And in doing so, the FBI kind of blinded other elements in the Justice Department and other agencies to the true Al-Qaeda threat. What I say in this new book, and this is a very serious charge, but I back it up with tremendous evidence, I believe that Fitzgerald and his unit, they could have stopped the African embassy bombings in '98. I believe that the Cole bombing could have been interdicted, and certainly the 9/11 plot, if this information was acted upon. Now, they're going to say, Peter Lance. Who's Peter Lance? This is 20/20 hindsight. It's very easy to go back. But all I can tell you is I base this on evidence that comes from these federal files themselves, these federal cases. What I had that other reporters don't have is time. Most Daily Deadline reporters have the tyranny of time, and they're covering these agencies, and they're beholden to them, as I said. What I did is I went back and I looked at some of this information comes out in the late afternoon when all the reporters have gone back to file their stories for the day. You wouldn't believe some of the stuff that comes out in federal trials. I'll give you just one of the nuggets that I found by looking at the El Sayed Nosair case. And just to get that transcript, I had to find 3 separate court reporters. I mean, you'd think in New York you could get a transcript of no. Not only that, but the DA's office helped me, and I put it together. And in that transcript, listen to what I found. I discovered that in 1990, the FBI knew about a certain mailbox in a certain location in New Jersey that El Sayed Nosair had. It was directly down the street from the Blind Sheikh's Mosque. It was as much a hotbed of Al-Qaeda-related activity. Nobody was using the name Al-Qaeda then, but certainly Islamic radicalism. And it was directly tied to the men, not only who killed Kahani, but later did the World Trade Center. So if this had been an organized crime venue, the feds would have set up a perch or a plant across the street as they did with Gotti. They would have watched it. They would have sat on it.
There's so much I want to ask you about. I want to jump because we got maybe...
Can I just tell you the payoff?
Yes,
that location in the summer of 2001 is where 3 of the hijackers got their fake IDs.
I see.
So if the FBI had sat on that location and just focused on it, they would have interdicted the 9/11 plot. That is one of the revelations in this new book, Triple Cross.
Which is what they usually do. I mean, isn't that what the FBI do?
Exactly.
Sit
That's
on
what they're best
locations
at.
and watch it.
That's
wait
how
for
they
somebody.
finally got Gotti after all those years.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, we can try and let's see. We'll try this in a
Sure.
second. We don't have much time.
Sure.
Hi, you're on.
Hello?
Hello?
Hi, got a question?
Yes, I do. Why does the government continue to stonewall me being a first responder, me and everybody else that was down there as far as getting help?
Well, when you say, I'm not sure if your question relates to you getting the help, but in terms of stonewalling, I mean, one of the people I write about in my first book is Ronnie Bucca, who I'm sure you know was one of the 343 firefighters who died. He was a fire marshal, actually was an ex-Green Beret with top secret clearance, and he believed, he'd been predicting for years that they were going to come back and hit the towers. And ironically, he died, not just died, but on the 78th floor of the South Tower that day. So yeah, the first responders, the citizens of this city have been cheated, and they've been cheated because they rely on the FBI. They've come to have this kind of false sense of reliance that the great FBI, charged with thwarting domestic terrorism since 1980, the oldest joint terrorist task force in the nation is in New York. Yeah. And we get this sense that, you know, we're being protected, but we're at great risk. And it's all about CYA. It's about covering up earlier acts of negligence. What we need is just people to come clean. Everybody makes mistakes. We just have to say, this is what happened, guys. How do we fix it so it doesn't happen again?
We're going to go on. Thank you very much, caller. And you're on.
This is what happened, guys. How do we fix it so
Hi, how you guys doing?
Thank you very much.
Go ahead, thank you.
Hey, this is a great show. I had a question for your guest.
You need to turn your TV down, bro.
I was wondering, with all the negligence going on.
Yeah, I hear that. I'm sorry. You just have to cut it off.
When you call, you have to turn
your TV down, volume down, so we can do it.
I wanted to ask about, say somebody's interested in this topic but doesn't have a lot of knowledge yet. Where would you suggest starting?
Well, the timeline that I have here, if you go to my website, peterlance.com, and it's just lance.com, and you click terrorism, you'll see this timeline. You can just scroll down, and this timeline will give you a really good overview.
An outline.
Yeah,
like
it.
Know what you're reading,
and the new book, by the way, we took this timeline and we've updated it with Ali Muhammad, so there will be a version of this in the new book. And then I have a host of FBI 302s. I mean, everything I'm saying.
What's a 302?
That's an internal FBI memo, and one of
they're made public.
Ultimately they're made public. You can get them through the Freedom of Information Act, and in this case, we were able to get them. Angela Clemente, an extraordinary research forensic analyst was able to get them, and we're able to use the FBI's own files to tell the story. This isn't some wild speculation.
I've seen that. I've read both your books, and they're very well documented in the sense that you're just describing, and tell an amazing story. We got a couple of minutes left. Can you, in 1 minute, say why you made such a strong connection between Flight 800, which is tell people what Flight 800 was, TWA 800, in 30 seconds, in a minute.
Well, TWA 800, as you know, was the flight that went down on the 10th anniversary, July 17th, 96, and there were many missile theorists believe it was shot down by a missile. I make the case in this book cover-up that this was an al-Qaeda bomb. Ramzi Youssef predicted to an FBI informant, and it was recorded in dozens of FBI 302s, we're going to have a bomb put on a plane to get a mistrial in the Bojinka case. The night of the most damaging evidence going into trial, the 17th, TWA 800 exploded. They found, it was the embodiment of Bojinka, the test flight he did in the Philippines. They found RDX, PETN, and nitroglycerin in the 17th to the 20th, high explosives, in the 17th to the 25th row. And the FBI...
you just earlier said was where Ramzi Youssef
was going to put the bomb.
Right.
So the FBI was about to call it. The New York Times even had a story, August 22nd, bomb evidence, and they did a 180-degree turn for reasons that I described.
The New York Times originally seemed to say that we're about to say this is a criminal act.
Absolutely. And
there was an article that said, I remember the article, and poof.
Yeah, and what happened was they explained the explosives by saying a bomb-sniffing dog test was conducted and the officer somehow spilled the explosives. Well, I got to that officer. I proved that he did the test on another plane. I took away the linchpin theory for how the explosives...
Peter Lance, we're running out of time, and we ran out of time. All right. All right, thank you very much, Peter Lance, for doing a wonderful show, very informative. We have to have you back again. Thanks a lot, and we'll see you next week on Let Them Talk.